Welcome to this discussion, Racialization and Migration, Latinas and Other Women in Sex Work and Trafficking Discourses in the Caribbean. My name is Patsy Lewis, and I'm a visiting professor of international and public affairs and faculty fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs and director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. The Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies is Brown University's oldest area studies center. We bring together more than 100 faculty, professionals, and graduate and undergraduate students across the university from different disciplinary perspectives who teach, research, and work on Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Latinx and Caribbean diasporas. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this discussion, and I am honored to introduce our two panelists today. Professor Kamala Kempadoo is professor in the Department of Social Science at York University, Canada, and the 2021 Craig M. Cogut Visiting Professor with Clarks at Brown, our center. She teaches Caribbean studies, Black radical and Black feminist thought, sex work studies, and critical anti-trafficking studies, and has published extensively on the Caribbean sex trade and global anti-trafficking discourses. She has a forthcoming book on Caribbean feminist methodologies, edited with Halima Deshang, and is currently working on a new collection on racism, coloniality, and anti-trafficking with Dr. Elena Shih. And Dr. Elena Shih is the Manning Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University, where she directs a human trafficking research cluster through the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Her book project, Manufacturing Freedom, Trafficking, Rescue, Rehabilitation, and the Slave-Free Good, is under contract with the University of California Press. Is a global ethnography of the transnational social movement to combat human trafficking in China, Thailand, and the United States. And we will begin with Professor Kempadoo speaking for around 30 minutes, and then Professor Shih will join her to discuss their co-edited book, which is to be published by Routledge in 2021. And the book features work from authors in different global contexts, including Brazil, Jamaica, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Ghana, Canada, and the United States, as well as empirical cases of labor and sex trafficking to reflect on the intersections between global white supremacy and colonialism in effort to combat trafficking. So after they have, Professor Kempadoo has spoken, and Professor Shih has, waded in and also added her comments. We'll open up the discussion to questions. You can use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen, or you can also choose to use the raise hand function. So welcome again. Thank you for coming, and I turn the discussion over to Kamala Kempadoo.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to Kate, Alton, Ellen, and of course, Director Patsy Lewis for organizing this event. And it's a pleasure to be associated with Clarks and to be the Cogut Visiting Professor at Brown this year. I will be teaching in the spring. So to jump straight in, I wanted to talk, to focus this talk on racism in the Caribbean because of the context we're right in now at the moment and the international attention. And also because we don't seem to talk enough about race and racism in the Caribbean region, even though we live and breathe it every day. And there's a lot that could be said about race in the Caribbean. I mean, from the anti-Black discrimination that was recently legislated in schools in Jamaica through the ban on dreadlocked hair, the kind of riots and tensions we've seen in Guyana between Indians and Africans around the recent elections there, the discussions we've been having about anti-Black prejudices in Indian Caribbean communities happening both you know, here in the region as well as in North America. And in Barbados, we, you know, often hear these things about the white shadows, sort of white businessmen with economic clout who have immense power and influence over post-colonial government. These are all sort of aspects of race and racism, which we could all talk about, and I'd be happy to talk about some aspects, and I'm sure some of the Caribbeanists can also talk about others. But what I wanted to speak about here, as you see from the title, and I'm just going to share my screen here, is the way in which racism and coloniality play a role in ideas about sex trafficking in the Caribbean, through a consideration of how migrant women in the region are discursively constructed in Caribbean countries such as Curacao, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, Suriname, and Guyana. Now, this connects to two dimensions of my work that Professor Lewis has just mentioned. My long-time focus on sex work, which started in the Caribbean, and the wider project that I'm engaged with, which is not just about the Caribbean, but about Black and brown bodies globally and how they are implicated in white supremacist and neo-colonial discourses of trafficking. And of course, Elena is working with me on this book on that latter project, and we'll talk about that in greater detail. So to begin with, a couple of months ago, Trinidad and Tobago held its national elections. And an acquaintance of mine wrote this on her Facebook. Let me just see if I can get to my next slide. Wrote this and posted this on Facebook. I have permission to reproduce it here. When I walked into the polling station, she wrote, I was greeted by a polling officer who, with obvious mockery and hostility, asked, Espanol? Hola. When I confirmed I was Trinidadian, she, with unveiled scorn, sought an audience and defended to the other officers nearby, well, what happened? She looked like one of them. The post goes on with her comment. I was not at all offended that she assumed I was a Venezuelan woman. I was offended that she openly disrespected me, thinking I was a Venezuelan woman, that in her mind, Venezuelan women deserved disrespect and shaming. In that brief moment, however, like a parallel universe, I was a Venezuelan woman. I was a migrant displaced by economic and socio-political crisis in my country, seeking shelter and refuge in a strange land, only to meet widespread discrimination and harsh judgment. I was spotlighted as someone who didn't belong. Now, this would not happen to everyone. My friend in question is of Indian descent. She has long, sleek black hair. She's young, light brown skinned, and she dresses stylishly. She's a fierce feminist and a wonderfully smart woman who carries herself with dignity and confidence. And again, I have her permission to use both her first Facebook post and her this poster, which was made for the Caribbean Feminist Association of Research and Action, CAFRA, TNT, a couple of years ago. Now, this Facebook post coincided with the publication of an article on Venezuelan refugee women in Trinidad by Tivia Collins and Richie Daly about the racialized femininity of Venezuelan refugee women in Trinidad. In that article, apart from the kind of hostility that Samantha, the woman here, describes, the researchers, Tivia and Richie, document how Venezuelan women's identity is negatively marked and stigmatized, where they are commonly referred to as effing Spanish and as being no good. They are generally assumed to be in sex work, either through force, i.e. being trafficked, or through their own volition. Either way, they are heavily stereotyped as unrespectable women and or sex slaves, out to take local women's men and jobs. And I've just put up a couple of quotes from the article about the association between women and sex work where you can see here that they're constantly being assumed to be prostitutes. And this is the Venezuelan women speaking here. You know, by immigration officers, by anybody, they are always being questioned and assumed that they're in sex work. Now, the article documents a lot more about their precarious situations and how, because of their situations, they can't actually get legal access to employment and so forth, and have to rely on help of people smugglers and other fixers to get them across borders, you know, find a job and a place to live and so forth. But I'm really concerned about the kind of construction of the Latina, in this instance, a Venezuelan woman, as a sexualized yet undesirable, unrespectable migrant woman. And this is not new. When I first researched sex work in Curacao in the Dutch Caribbean in the 1990s, it quickly came to my attention that the migrant sex workers were generally labeled as sandoms. And some of you who know my work will be familiar with this. This is a stereotype that had been constructed over the years, because since the 1940s, the Dutch state had authorized the operation of a 100-room brothel outside the city limits in Curacao. And it was set up to sort of maintain a semblance of respectability, to protect, as they said, Curaçaoan womanhood, local womanhood, from any association with prostitution, allowing only foreign women to work in the brothel. So consequently, women were invited or recruited to migrate to the island, were vetted by the Curaçaoan police, immigration and health authorities, and allowed to live and work in the state-regulated brothel for up to 3 months. The brothel was then, since the 1940s, and still is, totally reliant upon migrant women as sex workers. And initially, the majority were from Venezuela and Colombia, and that shifted. And when I was doing my fieldwork there, it was predominantly women from the Dominican Republic and Colombia who worked in Campo Alegre. The preponderance of Latinas and the strong association in the 1990s with women from the Dominican Republic led to the notion of the sandoms, which is the conflation of migrant sex workers with women from the capital of the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo. Sandom then was synonymous with whore on the island, but stood for more than just that. It connoted a particular type of racialized body, which was then applied to the wider population. So any Spanish-speaking woman on the island between the ages of around 18 and 35, who was light brown, had long, silky or possibly blonded hair, was curvaceous, dressed in form-fitting clothes, and had a bold air about them, was read as a sandom, as a whore. Now, what's interesting to me is that both Trinidad and Curacao are very mixed societies with a lot of ethnic variation and diversity in color, language, hair, looks. Of the Spanish woman, so-called Spanish woman, the Latina, with sex work is strong in both places. And there's a particular racialized body that is mobilized in that association. And we kind of saw that in the first example I gave you with Samantha. However, it's not only in the English or Dutch-speaking Caribbean that the sex work is constructed as a racialized figure, or that the migrant woman is racially eroticized. The situation in Puerto Rico is also very insightful. From research in San Juan by Amalia Cabezas and Ana Alcazar Campos on women from the Dominican Republic who work as barmaids, has shown that stigmas and discriminations around race and sexual labor combine to position the women as outside the nation, with the women being in very, very vulnerable positions in Puerto Rico. They hold very precarious status, they live and work in very harsh conditions. They are invisible, the researchers say, as citizens or resident subjects, and subjected to discrimination and xenophobia. Cabezas and Alcazar Campos found that they also were not imagined as either sex slaves or as victims of trafficking in need of rescue. And I'll come back to that later. even while they were being racialized and sexualized. And, you know, and many of their conditions seem to appear as if they are trafficked, right? But likewise, historically in Aruba, a sister island to Curacao in the Dutch Antilles, it was the Black Curaçaoan woman who was configured as the migrant whore, denigrated racially and sexually. Now, interestingly, Puerto Rico and Aruba do not define as Black nations, but as Latinized, light-skinned nations. And the following slide, I have two quotes from different articles. One about Puerto Rico, which is the top quote, and the bottom is about Aruba, talking about how the nations imagine themselves in Puerto Rico as where whiteness or off-white skin is sort of seen to be the norm and the universal social category, whereas the founding myth in Aruba is of the Euro mestizo, light-skinned, more Latino, Papiamento-speaking person. And that those kind of images, those kind of myths are what define those two nations. And it is there that we find then the Black migrant woman as marked as this sexual other. Now we see a similar trend in Barbados as well, until quite recently, young Guyanese women of African Indian descent, who are culturally distinct from Barbadians, were suspected of entering the country to become sex workers. Indeed, a decade ago, the media was claiming that easily 50% of the sex workers on the island were Guyanese women. Elisa Trotz, in surveying the media at the time about reports about Guyanese and Barbados at that time, noted that in the minds of Barbadians, Guyanese women were, and I quote, preying on unsuspecting Barbadian men in order to get themselves legalized, end of quote, or were thought to be taking away business from local sex workers. The stereotype circulating in Barbados was often of, as Elisa Trotz puts it, immoral and sexually loose Guyanese. And they were seen to be this body that was to be denied entry to the country and to be surveilled heavily. Now, this kind of sexualization of specific nationalities of migrant women can include Brazilians. Thaddeus Blanchett and Ana da Silva, in a chapter for our book, argue that the historical image of the Brazilian mulatta as sexually exuberant, racially degenerate, and naive attaches heavily to the migrant Brazilian woman. It rests, they note, on a wider construct of the whore as the degenerate, unruly, and unrespectable woman, but also on state-generated fears about migrant women as contaminants to the nation through their sexuality. And this also appears in countries in the Caribbean, such as in Suriname, which has a sizable Brazilian migrant worker population, especially for the gold and the lumber industries in the hinterlands, and where migrant women are heavily represented in sex work sites, where local women are either not found or allowed to work. So similar to Curacao, there's a national law forbidding local women employment in official brothels. And so migrant women make up the bulk of the sex workers there. And as what the authors of one study note, and I quote, the women who in Brazil were simply young women or poor mothers in Suriname are seen as shameless whores and are severely stigmatized. So what I'm suggesting is that the racialized other in the Caribbean varies through the region, with a context that still overwhelmingly privileges whiteness and lightness. And while the racialized sexualization of migrant women in Caribbean countries is not static and varies according to nationality, what is inescapable is that this construction of migrant womanhood is harmful in that it produces hostilities, scorn, and suspicion of specific groups of migrant women. It leads to greater policing and surveillance, and means that certain migrant women come under greater scrutiny or have refused entry at the border due to laws that criminalize prostitution and outlaw entry by anyone who's presumed to be a prostitute or a sex worker. Migrant women who are racialized and sexualized in particular ways are profiled by immigration officers at airports and other ports of entry. In Barbados, they used to have this thing called the Guyana bench, where women coming in from Guyana were put in the immigration before being allowed into the country to sit and wait there, and they were sort of scrutinized. Their documents were looked at. They were often held there for hours. And in Trinidad, as the Collins and Daly research shows, they might be asked by immigration officials if they are prostitutes, or they may be pressured for sex by the police in return for security. This has never and still does not apply to people who are identified as expats, white European or North American migrants who move to the Caribbean to live and work. Colonial racialized relations of power, I argue, still regulate the borders in the region. But what we have seen, especially in the last decade, is that the racialization and sexualization of migrant women is coupled with a discourse about human trafficking, which has also detrimental effects. Today, the greatest association of the eroticized migrant women population is with human trafficking. And around the region, it's easy to find examples of the women being identified as trafficked persons. This is simply done because there's a widespread understanding in the region and beyond that human trafficking means trafficking for the sex trade, that most trafficking is for the purposes of sexual exploitation. And you'll see here a slide about Operation Libertad, which was a project throughout the Caribbean region, most of the Caribbean islands and countries, by the Canadians, sponsored by the Canadian government, led by Interpol, where they were trying to rescue trafficked people. And the images sort of show the kind of people that they were rescuing and interrogating. Because migrant women are heavily associated with the sex sector, and because in global hegemonic understandings, which is led by the UN and the US State Department and pushed by global North radical feminists, sex work is defined as violence to women. Sex work is thus readily assumed to be something women would not willingly enter into, and migrant sex work is considered a priori forced or coerced. In other words, migrant women who end up in the sex work are almost automatically assumed to be trafficked. This understanding has been uncritically adopted in the Caribbean by NGOs, government departments, police and immigration, who have been mostly trained either by the US State Department or by the International Organization for Migration that does this work globally and holds trainings. And while the US trafficking laws and the UN protocol include protections for victims of trafficking, there is what we call collateral damage, which includes women being infantilized and defined as helpless, ignorant, and duped, and seen to be in the need of rescue, or being treated as criminals and undesirables. And we see this collateral damage, so-called, in the Caribbean, despite the noise and grand claims of governments being in compliance with the US and UN policies and laws. So, for example, there's this anti-trafficking trade raid in Guyana, in Bartica. This is a couple of years ago. The raid led to the arrest of 27 women from the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, who were believed to be victims of human trafficking. Of the 27 women, I think we see most of them there, 11 were to be charged, 4 with overstaying their time in Guyana, and 7 with illegal entry, and they faced deportation. I believe they were deported. The remainder were detained and were supposed to assist police with investigations into the matter. That is how it's reported. All were removed from their workplaces in Bartica, which is in the interior in Guyana, and sent to the capital, Georgetown, for further processing. And I doubt whether they were allowed to actually go back to Bartica, even if they weren't undocumented migrants. Or as Cabezas and Alcazar Campos point out, the Dominicana in Puerto Rico is not recognized as a victim in need of protection or rescue by the state. She's neither seen as a Black sexualized figure who sullies the nation and who is to be expelled. The problem then is that the migrant women in the Caribbean were subjected to xenophobia, eroticization, and stigmatization, and perceived by the governments and the public alike as bad, loose, and illegal women. They do not fit neatly into the anti-trafficking rhetoric of helpless, innocent victims who need to be rescued from slavery, violence, and abuse. They are more likely to be apprehended under immigration laws and deported than they are offered economic security, residency, and shelter. Now, few countries in the region actually have any anti-trafficking legislation. And when they do, there are minimal protections offered for trafficked persons. Or as in the case of the Dominican Republic, a person can only access protection if they provide enough information to the authorities. And as the IOM, in their review of the situation in the Caribbean in 2017 point out, the lack of legislation in the region means that, and I quote them, irregular border crossing is criminalized a priori, end quote, with the consequence that the victims of human trafficking, they say, may therefore also be punished by the juridical system. In other words, the women in the region, these migrant women, are more likely than not treated as illegal migrants and criminals, right? Irrespective of the kind of conditions they're working in, the kind of ways in which they've crossed borders, and so forth. Now, there is a new human trafficking research project that's being undertaken as we speak, and should be concluding soon. I'm not sure that it's going to deliver critical insights, but it'll certainly give us some new information about how people are being treated at the border, because the examples I'm giving are all from a couple of years, and I haven't found any kind of information that speaks to anything different yet about the women, people who are caught in anti-trafficking raids being actually given real protections. Then this brings me to talk about the broader framework of anti-trafficking to try to make sense of what we are witnessing in the Caribbean. First of all, human trafficking as we understand it today emanates from a neoliberal discourse that is deeply attached to constructions of citizenship and nation, belonging and non-belonging, and even freedom, which are coded in argument and has been subject to a lot of research and discussion since the early aughts. And this in part is how anti-trafficking plays out in the Caribbean as a mechanism to control immigration and secure the nation. And this, there are many people who have written about this, including Elena. So I don't have to rehearse that here. It's not new. And it's happening around the world, and a lot of scholars are actually paying attention to those aspects. What we haven't, I think, paid as much attention to until now are the racial and colonial investments in anti-trafficking and the implications that has globally. And that, if you like, is what our book is about. So what we know from countless studies, from historical documents and so forth, is that human trafficking was initially in the 19th and early 20th century framed around the victimization of helpless white women by manipulative men of color, foreign men who were said to lure naive, innocent, even virginal young white women into selling sex and trap them against their will in the sex trade. It was called then the white slave. right? And because the objective then was the protection of white womanhood, from its inception, non-white so-called victims of trafficking have not been treated the same way. They are more often identified as illegal migrants, lawbreakers, and undesirables. And this has continued from a discourse of white slavery into the present-day version of human trafficking. So Arifa Raza, a legal scholar who has a chapter in our book, examines a key contemporary US anti-trafficking law, the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, starting in the mid-1990s. And she demonstrates through a close reading of government debates, reports, and hearings about the creation of this special visa for trafficking victims called the T visa, that distinctions were made between European women and children as victims of human rights violations and deserving of protection, and global South migrants as illegals, criminals, and traffickers, worthy of protection, of prosecution, and punishment. This distinction, she argues, exposes the racialized intent of the current anti-trafficking legislation and upholds a long-standing racist immigration system of the United States. Similarly, Elia Durisin, installation of post-socialist women in the late 1990s, early aughts, that anti-trafficking legislation was framed, began to be discussed in the Canadian Parliament. But she also discovered that the trafficked victim was considered in Canada white, but not quite, as she puts it, and subjected to immigration control and regulation. They were Russian and Eastern European women predominantly. Durisin's work demonstrates that a hierarchy of whiteness underpins anti-trafficking laws, where the so-called girl next door, who we should read as white, is a quintessential trafficked victim who is to be rescued, with non-white migrant women being subject to surveillance and immigration controls. And Elaine Lam and her co-authors have a piece in chapter in our book, which perhaps Elena can also, and I can come back to, documenting the way in which Asian women in particular, Chinese women specifically, are targeted by immigration control and are constantly under sort of this idea of being trafficked victims. In a similar vein, Samuel Okere and Peter Olayiwola, I suppose, in a chapter for our book, interrogate the way that anti-trafficking and anti-slavery campaigns advocate that Africans, especially Nigerians, stay at home. The campaigns weigh very heavily in favor of migration deterrence out of a stated humanitarian concern about precarious migration routes, migrant death, and labor exploitation. Moreover, in their study with Nigerian migrant women in Ghana, they show that in hindering the women's ability to move around the world safely and securely, anti-trafficking campaigns serve as an impediment for African women to access benefits of globalization. Anti-trafficking and anti-slavery discourses and campaigns in this way appear to be part and parcel of broader racial projects to keep Black bodies, keep Black people out of Europe, and as an extension, if you like, of the process that Walter Rodney, a Guyanese scholar, identified as the underdevelopment of Africa by Europe. Although this is no longer being done under colonialism, but instead under neoliberal racial capitalism. So we are seeing that anti-trafficking is also premised on assumptions about the race of a nation, the so-called race, about who in terms of race can be considered a legitimate citizen, whom the state and society should protect, extends rights to and support, and who should be kept out and deterred from entering the country. Maintaining racial and national purity appears to lie at the heart of the anti-trafficking enterprise. And it's perhaps not surprising that anti-trafficking work internationally is also being flagged as bolstering white subjectivity and as translating into white saviorism. Again, Elia Durisin's chapter in our book for example, argues that anti-trafficking is led by well-meaning white women and works to co-constitute white women's subjectivity and white feminist identity, and is deeply entangled with a white feminism that upholds state racialized and militarized violence and carceral politics. Likewise, Gregory Mitchell argues that the idea of noblesse oblige, as he says it, those with wealth, power, and status who have an affirmative obligation to help their social inferiors, end quote, underpins contemporary voluntourism, that is the adventure travel with the aim of helping or uplifting local communities, and informed anti-trafficking, anti-sex trafficking initiatives. Mitchell goes on to note, that the savior-based model of anti-trafficking is rooted in whiteness, is deeply attached to feelings of self-righteousness, supports carceral politics, and recreates the colonial encounter. This kind of critique of voluntarism is not isolated nor reducible to anti-trafficking work. For example, there's this We Charity that was formerly Free the Children in Canada. There's this article from a woman who did some of her undergraduate studies in international development, and she describes the reality of white saviorism, seeing it as an extension of white privilege and primarily beneficial to white subjectivity. Perhaps the most extreme example of the entanglement of white supremacy and anti-trafficking rhetoric can be found in the way in which QAnon, the alt-right conspiracy theory, has launched its so-called Save the Children campaign in response to what they see as an elite child sex trafficking ring comprised of democratic politicians and celebrities, who, among other things, they believe run the deep state and want to mongrelize the white race. This is taken from their site. A white power movement has thus openly claimed the discourse of human trafficking. And a primary concern is about saving white children from what they call a Satan worshipping cabal, that they say kidnaps white children, keeps them in secret prisons run by pedophiles, slaughter and eat them to gain power from their essence in their blood. And I'm sure you've been hearing some of this about QAnon in the news recently. Now, as much as we'd like to dismiss QAnon, we also know they are wielding some power in the US and have not been disavowed by the current occupant of the White House. Mainstream anti-trafficking campaigners and organizers are said to be infuriated at what they see as the hijacking of the trafficking discourse by this movement, as they claim it is silencing their own campaigns and the voices of the genuinely trafficked. And they say it's based on exaggerated data, false accusations, and partisan rhetoric. I would venture to say that this recent manifestation of anti-trafficking exposes the very foundations of anti-trafficking discourse for what it is: simplistic fabrications about very complex realities of working migrant people's lives that feed a white supremacist agenda and racialized relations of power. The ramifications of such a discourse on the global South, the Caribbean included, cannot be underestimated. And this is partly what we're trying to look at, in the book that Elena and I are doing. Through North American definitions of human trafficking and mechanisms such as the Trafficking Persons Report the US puts out, which places sanctions on countries that do not comply with US anti-trafficking ideas, the rest of the world has been browbeaten into adopting US ideas and standards on trafficking. The fight against human trafficking is then often a blatant instrument of US global hegemony and is wielded politically time and again. Now, I've written about this elsewhere, so I don't really have to go into great detail there. But I just want to point out that we've seen, for example, countries that oppose or defy the US, and which are often defined as socialist, rogue, or non-compliant states, such as Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, Eritrea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Zimbabwe, are more likely than not placed in tier 3 in the TIP report and threatened with economic sanctions by the US State Department. and they're systematically listed as havens for human trafficking. Now, a very recent example of this is how the Cuban medical brigades, which has nothing to do with sex work, have been held up by the US Republicans as an example of human trafficking. And this is quite remarkable. Florida Senator Rick Scott, along with Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, put a bill on the Senate floor in June to try to undercut Cuba's medical missions program. And this is what Scott had to say. As he said, this is the latest example of Cuba actively engaging in human trafficking with their sham medical program. This is not about helping anyone. Cuba uses this program as a way to funnel money to their regime and rarely pays a living wage to the physicians they force to work in other countries. Cuba is using the coronavirus pandemic for profit at the expense of these hardworking physicians. This is Scott. We cannot allow it. Any country that requests medical assistance from Cuba is aiding their human trafficking efforts. The international community will stand against the use of forced labor and the Cuban regime's exploitation of this crisis. And this was taken directly from Rick Scott's website. So anti-trafficking this way, particularly in America's backyard, is part of the US effort to force the rest of the world into compliance with its own doctrines and ideologies, while it sustains unequal relations of power between North and South, between elites and poor, and between whites and people of color. It can therefore be seen as part and parcel of what decolonial scholars call global coloniality, that global condition, a mold that has been molded through capitalism, made possible by Western European colonialism from the 16th century on. And I think we can locate anti-trafficking discourse right in that kind of node of global coloniality. It is possible to trace from white slavery to its present day formulation how it has been produced within coloniality, whether it's by radical Western feminists who wanted to save their fallen sisters, or Westernized states wanting to curb migration of racial and ethnic others, or by white Christian neoliberals, right-wing conspiracists, but also leftist, anti-slavery abolitionists and humanitarians who traverse the world eager to get rid of what they're seen as a modern-day problem. Human trafficking has been conceptualized within a colonial epistemological framework. And for the last 2 decades or so, this discourse has circulated globally, mobilized Damascus, its geopolitical and body political epistemic location. In the Caribbean, this translates into a seeming contradiction where we have a discourse that identifies racialized migrant women as victims of sex trafficking. Yet because of the anti-immigration and nationalist premises upon which the discourse rests, it is aimed at keeping those migrants out. It thus masks a neo-colonial nationalist agenda, parading under the guise of humanitarianism and development, perhaps even feminism, which in the name of rescuing victims, racially stereotypes the migrants and pushes them away or further underground. Sex industries become the sites where immigration and police raids can easily produce success, as they invariably find someone to arrest from being outside of the law. And it is in such raids that racialized, sexualized migrants, such as the Spanish in Trinidad, the Sandoms in Curacao, the Dominicanas in Puerto Rico, and Brazilians in Suriname are the first to be apprehended, detained, and deported. And this is an image from Venezuelan women who were recently detained in Trinidad at a party in COVID. And even though it was suspected that they were engaged with sex work, they were deemed to be illegal migrants and were treated as such. Now I'm just going to wrap up here. I've gone over my time a little bit, but I just want to say we do see some recognition in the Caribbean that the anti-trafficking discourse is political, and here the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States has rejected and Senator Scott's call for calling the Cuban medical brigades human trafficking, and they pushing back against that. And so that's really important. So recognizing that it's a very politicized kind of discourse that's being wielded there. And we also see some recognition that anti-sex work laws, policies and practices are harmful. And the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition calls for the support of decriminalization of sex work around the region to reduce incidents of rights violations and so forth. What we need more of, though, and which I don't have a slide for because I couldn't find any image to fit this or any text, is the linking of the two and a recognition of the social harm and political harm that the coupling brings, with a greater call for an end to the racialization, sexualization, and stigmatization of migrant working women. I'd like to see that. And I'll end it here. Thank you. You have to unmute. Pat, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't imagine that after using Zoom so often, I still forget the unmute button. I just want to say thanks for a very a fascinating discussion. And there is a hand up, and I want Elena to speak, but I want to interject a question. Is it that, I think looking at sex trafficking or the sex trade through the lens of race in the Caribbean is fascinating and suggests, the complexity of how issues of migration intersect with race and criminalization. But I was wondering, are you saying that there is no basis for exploring exploitation in sex work, or looking at the structures that support the exploitation of migrant women or even local women? In Jamaica has large numbers of girls missing every year, and the assumption is that they are pressed into the sex trade in the North Coast. So are you saying that these things don't exist, or is it a problem with the terminology of trafficking, which seems to be a catch-all phrase that anything can be bundled into, that doesn't allow for nuancing? So I just wanted to get that straight before, we move on.
Certainly. We can't. I usually always say no. I can never say. I will always say there is exploitation in the sex sector, and there are conditions that make it very difficult. And a big part of that has to do with that fact that it's illegalized, that it's criminalized. Right? Prostitution is criminalized in most of the Caribbean countries, and so people have to work in the informal sector. Right? And there's a lot of abuse of people's work and bodies and labor in that informal sector that can't actually also be reported, that is not monitored, and that's not controlled. So there is a lot of harm and exploitation that takes place. What the anti-trafficking rhetoric does is suggest that if they catch a few people and if they employ this term of anti-trafficking, they will, remedy the situation. And what I'm trying to show is that in doing so, what they're actually doing is just sending people back home or deporting people, and not actually addressing the issues of exploitation and harm that women in the sex sector and sex trade do face. Right? Okay. So anti-trafficking is just another layer of harm on top of, of already exploitative situation.
Okay, thanks. I'll just take the question from Gina Canepa, and then I'll ask Elena to come in with some comments. Gina, you have to turn your sound off. You have to unmute yourself. Ellen, do you unmute Gina? Okay. You should be able to talk now, Gina.
She needs to unmute.
Kate Elling, can she be unmuted?
I can't unmute her. This is Kate, but she could put the question in the Q&A box.
Oh, okay. In the meantime, while we're waiting for Gina, Elena, would you like to come in and?
Sure, I have a response to that same question, so I think it works well, and then we'll hear from Gina soon. I think the other variant to what Kamala was talking about is if we listen to this, if we hear when sex workers themselves and sex worker rights activists are asked this question, so like, what about the true cases of exploitation? They often say, like, we as sex worker activists working in these countries are some of the best people to tell you about the continuum of exploitation that may exist in this industry, as exploitation in its continuum exists in all forms of work. So one question that they pose back is, do people inquire with the same level of like hysteria and that kind of inquiry of like, what are the different levels of systemic exploitation that happen in all forms of informal and low-wage employment? And oftentimes, because we have so much emphasis on sex trafficking as opposed to non-sexual forms of labor trafficking, agriculture, garment work, domestic work, there tends to only be a focus on sex. But people will say, hey, I don't just do sex work. I also have worked as a nanny. I've worked in the garment industry. I've worked in restaurants, and I assess like my risks to exploitation alongside like all these different low-wage industries that I've worked in. And so that global rallying cry of sex work is work is one that really asks us to evaluate the particular precarities of working in the sex industry alongside all these other different kinds of work that migrants are working in. And that second point of like trust sex workers to be the ones who have the best access to understand what's happening here really points to, I think, a key theme of our volume around the consequences of the global racialization of sex work in, as Kamala has mentioned, bolstering certain kinds of white subjectivity, white supremacy, and white saviorism, is that all of this comes at immense profit to the organizations that are doing so. And so what you have seen since the passing of the UN Palermo Protocol and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, in the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act, is a huge escalation in what Carol Lee has called the anti-trafficking industrial complex, the consolidation of huge amounts of wealth, public-private partnerships, corporate and government funding of like brand new organizations that are seemingly appearing out of nowhere, largely American and or global North organizations that descend into these places, engage in these one-off rescues, and completely like, not just like eliminate, overshadow the work that had already been being done by local organizers on the ground, but it is a zero-sum game that then they take all of the funds and you have local organizations that had been working on these issues to better occupational health and safety or to expose or to help people leave the sex industry if they want, completely unable to. And that's where you see the reproduction of these completely like colonial scripts and very, very racist ones. And so I just wanted to share my screen really quickly because I thought Kamala's images were very provocative, but just here, I don't think we need to look much further than this organization, Operation Underground Railroad, which is a fantastic case of tying in not only white supremacy, but the fundamental anti-Blackness of anti-trafficking efforts, as one of our authors in the volume, Lindsay Buchan, has written extensively about. So literally basing the founding of their organization in 2013 off of the history of the Underground Railroad in the United States in freeing Black slaves, but changing that to be literally a group. And like, I am not somebody who exclusively relevates this like idea of white saviors to phenotypically white people, but it is absolutely like unacceptable when this is what the organization that gets like tens of millions of dollars every year from, you know, the State Department and others to do their work, comprised entirely of white people from the global north, going into countries like Haiti, like Thailand, like in Ghana, working with local law enforcement on like these one-off instances of rescue, celebrating them, you know, to their cause of ending trafficking and becoming abolitionists, and then tying it all up in a bow by telling the story of Harriet Tubman. And when you talk to people who have actually, like when you talk to the families of people who have been so-called rescued, which of course nobody ever does because they're not allowed to have a voice, you hear, and this is another organization, International Justice Mission, that another one of our authors who Kamala's already mentioned, Sam O'Keefe, has worked extensively with in Ghana, or he doesn't work with the organization. He interviews people who have been rescued by the organization. And in a piece that's not for our volume, but in his most recent work, devastating findings of these families of the people, of the children who are so-called saved on Lake Volta. And here, again, a direct consequence between these new forms of global neoliberal capitalism in rescue directly tied to histories of colonialism. So in Ghana, the argument being there isn't enough infrastructure in terms of roads, schools on these lakes due to like all the vestiges of like historic colonialism. And rather than treat deeper systemic causes that address inequality and lack of access and poverty, it's really easy to stigmatize this as an area where backwards people are putting their children to work in fishing boats. And you have these dramatic instances of rescue of people swooping in, of course, with like very, very, you know, these kinds of poverty porn photos, and then ultimately tied up with an ask for funding. Yet again, partnering with local Ghanaian law enforcement and local government who have a vested interest in partnering with American NGOs because of the aforementioned Trafficking in Persons report and ranking mechanism put out by the US State Department. So it's such a complex web of like profit, state collusion with private sector actors, with nonprofits. It's really hard, I think, to get at what some of the like consequences have been when the people who have the largest voices in this are now these NGOs that have some of the largest budgets like we've ever seen. And you don't see this kind of funding for migrant rights. You don't see it for like any sort of development related concern, but if you do funnel it through the lens of trafficking, you suddenly get so much. And so I love that part of your question, Patsy, that just asks, is it just that trafficking is the wrong lens? Does it encompass too much? And I think absolutely now, yes, trafficking can mean anything from like adoption to rape to, you know, consensual sex,
medical
consensual sex. Yeah, right, and right. It's here in QAnon. So yeah, it's so helpful to have heard Kamala's overview. And be able to like share a little bit of how other authors like approach these same questions.
There's a comment on the chat from Jerry Augusto who says, all I can say is how absolutely obscene when she looks at the pictures that you've been sharing. But I wanted to ask, let me just make sure that I'm not right. I wanted to ask about the regulatory framework around trafficking and the role of the US and its use of economic and political coercion by labeling countries, and how, if that isn't in a sense part of the problem that you're grappling with, and not just a phenomenon of exploitation, or even how you choose to term that form of exploitation, but the global structures of inequality in terms of how you define sex trafficking, how you try to give cultural context to it, and the frameworks for sanctions. Would you guys like to comment on this, the UN's approach to to trafficking versus the US approach and how coercion comes into it and then reinforces a kind of powerful weak country north-south divide.
Mm-hmm. Shall I start off, Elena? First of all, the UN protocol on trafficking is a bit more nuanced than the US State Department's version, but it has no teeth to it, right? It's a convention that countries sign on to and they can use. So they, you know, the UN provides this umbrella definition of trafficking, which, you know, is very vague. So a lot of things can fall under it. It's the US State Department who's taken upon itself to police the world on this issue. And so every year they go around and evaluate what a country has done on the basis of its own standards and its ideas about what trafficking is. And in the US, the trafficking is being particularly conservatively defined. And so it's very tightly tied to the idea of sexual exploitation. As I say, often sex work is conflated with trafficking through partly a feminist push in the US. That's made it so. And then it carries these kind of economic sanctions so that countries, if they don't live up to, you know, the US standards, they are threatened with cuts into their humanitarian aid, for example. So this is of real concern to countries, particularly poor countries in the global south. And we see it in the Caribbean every year that the US TIP report comes out. Some Caribbean government objects because they are being put into a category where they don't think they belong, you know, and being threatened with sanctions because they're being pushed. I mean, really it is you know, a US push to conform to this idea about trafficking, whereas I think Caribbean governments would much more readily and easily want to address exploitation, right, in all kinds of forms, but yet they're being sort of pushing and in very narrow terms. That's what. So the US state version is particularly harmful internationally, and it doesn't respond well to the ways in which local governments want to understand exploitation, right, and the harms there. They don't do a good job of adjusting their, you know, the tip to that. Okay. Elena, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I think just a little bit more specificity about the annual trafficking in persons report. It demands a ranking across 4 tiers every year, where countries are placed into either tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3, the worst tier, and then this very, very nefarious tier 2 watch list, which is the warning to like the vast majority of countries in the world are in tier 2, and if you don't meet the US claimed minimum standards to improve your efforts along the lines of prosecution, protection, and prevention. So this is like the rubric that they've signed off on, then you can be moved to tier 3. And tier 3 allies with international monetary institutions like the IMF and World Bank to enforce economic sanctions. So for many, it's really difficult to even disentangle a US versus a UN response, because you see that US as, you know, the person that's doing the ranking and its collusions with multilateral lending institutions basically is just trying to serve as proxy for like what Janie Chuang early on called as the global sheriff around trafficking. And I think
Elena, it's not enough to have people charged. You also have to have convictions. So you also judge on whether you have convictions, isn't that so?
Absolutely, and that's what's prompted so many, like Elizabeth Bernstein, to point to the fundamentally carceral feminist leanings of all of this, is that the most important thing is really rarely prevention, but it is prosecution. Is if you can demonstrate numbers of people being prosecuted, that's really important. And even in the T visa, which Kamala mentioned before, which is a protection mechanism, you can only get this if you participate in prosecution against your traffickers. which is a threshold of like proving victimhood that people have found really, really difficult to attain. So yeah, absolutely a complete focus on prosecution and these like law enforcement arms, which maybe makes me think a little bit of Elaine Lamb's and her co-authors' contributions to the book. Elaine is the founder and executive director of an organization called Butterfly that works with migrant Asian massage workers in Toronto as they face like incredible criminalization and policing of their work in the name of rescuing victims of trafficking. And so unlike Black and Latino women who are hypersexualized and racialized in a particular way, or like as aggressors, not deserving of victimhood treatment, the Asian woman has always been like the ideal sex slave. And when she deviates from that, poses a real threat. And so again, all of these voluntary massage workers, some of which who engage in different kinds of erotic and intimate labor, when they express not wanting to leave the industry or no remorse for being forced, frauded, or coerced into doing this kind of work, they are targeted for deportation and arrest. And so I think that these parallel cases are interesting to show how like different kinds of racialization shape the impacts on racial minority migrant sex workers.
Thank you. There's a question from Maria Inclán. And Maria wants to know if there are any alternative international voluntaristic organizations attending to the structural causes of trafficking. If so, what is their budget in comparison to the ones you just described, and what is their impact?
So the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, for example, is based in Bangkok. It's a sort of umbrella organization that links a lot of the organizations that work on the ground with sex workers, domestic workers in the informal sectors and so forth. And they push back against this hegemonic kind of idea of trafficking and certainly try to formulate it in a different way, attentive to the very particularities of the local context and so forth. But they are a very marginalized group in the international arena. I mean, they have a voice, they have a journal. We have, there's a journal they put out as well of the work they're doing. They hold a lot of conferences. They're invited to policy tables now and then, but I don't know what their budget is in terms of the kind of anti-trafficking funds, but I believe that they are not heavily funded, not to the extent that some of the organizations that Peter and Sam, for example, describe around Nigeria are funded millions through European Union in order to prevent so-called trafficking, and it goes to these government NGOs. So the sort of alternate, organizations that are doing a lot of on-the-ground work and would not necessarily classify it quickly as trafficking, but really want to address the kind of harms that migrant women and others are experiencing, are the underfunded groups. And they're generally a lot of women's organizations and shelters and so forth. I know, from Guyana, for example, in the Caribbean, that like Red Thread, the organization in Guyana, is an important women's organization. They are not getting the government funding. It's going to the ministry in Guyana, for example, and their police force and so forth. And people are being trained, other NGOs are being trained in the country through the ministries, through the police force, and through and the monies are not going to the women's organizations that are doing on the ground work. That's just one example that I know very concretely of. So there's a big imbalance there in terms of funding.
Thank you. Would you like to tell us some more about some of the themes in your book, or even some of the examples? What would the themes in Brazil look like compared to the US, for example? because you're looking at a wide range of countries. Would you like to speak a little more?
Yeah, I think something that we haven't, I mean, we've focused a lot on sex and sex trafficking, and I think the book does a really great job of also covering different types of labor exploitation. So we have people writing about the situation of domestic workers in Hong Kong, in Canada, male construction workers in the Netherlands. The Netherlands?
No, the Romanian workers
Romanian.
in Denmark.
Or in
In
Denmark.
Denmark, the construction workers in Denmark, men.
Yeah, and so I think across all of those, we see the same kinds of racializing effects on like perpetrators and ideal victims. So in a lot of these cases, so in particular in that, in Marlene Spanger's work about men in the construction industry, how it's really, really difficult to see them, even though they face like extreme forms of exploitation, as victims in this whole game. But because they're dark-skinned migrants, they were typically used to just thinking of them as criminals and like writing them off. And I think that absolutely happens in the United States as well, when lawyers are faced with male agricultural workers who absolutely are trafficked to this country. They often find that it's far easier to apply for like a U visa, which is about like continued presence for people who have been victims of crime, than it is to apply for a T visa, which is specifically around trafficking, because trafficking has conjured up so many images of like a particular racialized woman subject. And so I think like the racialized differences of masculinity and femininity and who are perpetrators and victims is really important here. And it also continues to like different kinds of work. I think the different cases, in some ways it's going to be, it's hard to write our introduction because we're aware that North American understandings of race, racism, and racialization don't necessarily carry over into different contexts. So we've had to ask like the European authors writing about France, for instance, to give us a lot of context of what anti-Blackness or white supremacy might look like there. Same with Hong Kong and Brazil. I think the rich context of like racism, its relationship to colonialism, illustrates a lot of the differences also that appear in these different places.
I think that's a fascinating discussion in its own right, how race is seen and manifested in different contexts. I mean, your discussion of the Caribbean, in one context where being Black means you're sexualized, in another context being brown skin and light or speaking with a Spanish accent means you're criminalized. It's really fascinating. So
it is, and these constructions of nation are very, I mean, very important to think about, and they're messy. I mean, there's, you know, but it's, and that's what we're trying to also, you know, look at in this book by taking up these discussions in various places like Scandinavia, you know, Western Europe, Hong Kong, Asia, New Zealand. Pieces coming in from, and Canada, as well as Brazil. We have a good representation, but we also have some pieces about indigenous populations in both the US and Canada, which are important aspects also in the way in which they are being impacted by, you know, anti-trafficking discourses as well. And of course, then race plays also a different, you know, emerges in a different way around indigenous populations. So yeah, so it's you know, it's fascinating to do this book because of that complexity around the world, and how we can think about racism. And part of the reason why we also needed to expand our sort of framework to thinking about coloniality more generally as a vehicle for upholding sort of, the global North hegemony as important in this discussion. Yeah.
I just have, nobody's asking any questions yet, but so I'm just wondering if you're reflecting at all on how the framing of sex trafficking as a concept obscures the different ways in which legal systems, national legal systems, address different forms of exploitation that might be delegitimized because they don't seem to fall clearly under a human trafficking label. Is that one of the considerations at all?
I mean, sex trafficking just grabs everybody's attention very quickly and very easily. So it pushes a lot out of the way. And it has that effect. It conjures up very quickly this image of, sex slaves, young women who are captured and held behind bars. And we see these images time and time again. They're used around the world as ways to sort of tell us about trafficking. And it's, invariably, a picture of a young farm boy, being exploited doesn't carry the same kind of, shock and all kind of effect as does this idea of a young woman being forced into sex work, right? So sex trafficking does kind of obliterate, if you look, a lot of, or it really kind of, covers over, or pushes down, I suppose, out. A lot of other kinds of exploitations and harms that we are seeing, particularly for migrant workers. And just galvanizes us being harmful, exploitative, and so forth. So I find it unhelpful as a concept, sex trafficking. Yeah.
Okay. I think, yeah. Go on, Elena.
There has been definitely a slow shift at the level of the administration to respond to, what early scholars like Kamala had been demanding in late 90s and early 2000s for the shift away from sex trafficking. And so you do see global discourse and US policy trying to attend to issues of labor exploitation, particularly within the last decade. And I think what's been most troubling about that is that somehow they've all centered on corporate attempts to address this idea of inequality in the global supply chain. And so new pieces of legislation starting in 2010 with the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, and then the subsequent 2015 EU and UK modern day slavery acts have all demanded a level of corporate transparency to look at different levels of subcontracting across global manufacturing. And the reason that's been that's created another kind of elision of a global South worker-driven voice is that it's put all of the money and all of the power once again now in the corporate actors, and completely removed any sense of worker organizing or worker voice from this perspective. So really forbid that we give workers the rights to organizing or collective bargaining. We would just rather have really, really fancy modern day slavery statements from the top retailers and brands in the world. And this is enough to satisfy a kind of global commitment around labor trafficking, and has consolidated again all of this wealth and all of this intention at the top, completely at the exclusion of workers. And COVID-19 has absolutely illuminated a lot of problems that exist in the global manufacturing industry. And these global North suppliers have left workers in factories in like completely precarious positions, but yet nearly all, I mean, it's a great exercise to just Google the modern day slavery statement of, you know, some of the places where you like to buy things from, like Target, Walmart, Costco, Gap, H&M. They all have beautifully written modern day slavery statements that, you know, lawyers were paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to make airtight and in compliance with these new modern slavery laws. And you talk to workers in those factories who make stuff for those brands, and none of their demands have been met, which is like true since forever. But now we have this like corporate greenwashing effect of these anti-trafficking initiatives where all the corporates can say that they are doing things because they have all invested in these new like anti-trafficking divisions, responsible sourcing divisions. And so this is another like problematic new trend of consolidation at the top, not in sex trafficking, but as we've seen the shift away from sex to non-sexual labor.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to draw to our attention, Kamala, before we wrap up?
No, I think I've covered quite a lot in my talk, and I tried to touch on various aspects. As we work through our book, and the chapters are still coming in, and and we'll be working them, I think Elena and I will be wrestling this into a more coherent framework as to how we talk about this, in the global context. And it's challenging, but it's really important, I think, that we push ahead with this project, partly because we don't really, as I said in my talk, race and racism is really not addressed head on in the anti-trafficking circuits very much. I mean, more people are beginning to take it up, but it still needs a lot more thinking about it and a lot more attention for it, as we've been talking about today. So it's an exciting project to do, and also I'd like to follow what's going on in the Caribbean, to keep seeing what's happening here. And I don't have a lot of clout in terms of the policy discussions that are happening, but we will be seeing some new documents, research coming out, I imagine, quite soon. And I'd be very curious as to see where that takes us in the region.
Okay, thank you. Elena?
I'm just so excited that Kamala is joining our community, though virtually, and want to shout out her course for next semester on Caribbean feminisms. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
I know that our undergrads and grad students will find her like so illuminating to study with, as I have. So welcome to Brown. You're supposed to be here in Providence with us right now. We're so sorry that you can't be, but you are.
I'll get there. It's really fun to be attached to the center. It's really great to be attached to the center and to work with all of you there. So
we're very happy. We're very happy to have you, Kamala, and we really hope that you can be with us next semester. And so I want to thank you and Elena for this very, very interesting discussion. I want to thank my colleagues at Clark's, in particular Kate, and my colleagues at Watson, in particular Ellen, for their role in helping to make this run smoothly. And darkness is descending, as you can see. Evenings are coming earlier now. So I started off in the daylight and now I'm in the dark. But so I think, that it's time to wrap up. So I just want to thank you and, say how grateful I am for this discussion. And thank you all for coming and staying. Maybe the next time you present, you'll have more questions from the audience, and I would be dominating the discussion less, but I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you all.